All right. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian of City the Immaculata back with you. Hello, Papists, one and all. I'm starting a little bit early today because I just opened up my notes and I'm like, holy cow, what was I thinking? How many notes did I take on this? So I want to get started a little early to make sure I got time to finish up. I'm waiting for the day when StreamYard decides to no longer work for me. I guess I'm probably going to have to start thinking about, I'm a creature of habit. I'm going to have to start thinking about a different site. I better not say anything while it's allowed to tank the stream while I'm doing it. All right, so for today, for those of you who aren't aware, one of my main interests in my real life studies is the university in the Middle Ages, with a particular emphasis on Oxford. Now, Paris, of course, is the hub, the mothership. It's the place where all of the most learned eventually want to end up, both as students and as masters. But I have a special place in my own heart for particular reasons for the Oxonian tradition, which is, as you may or may not be aware, has its own long-standing history of disputation and debate, which will be the main focus of the topic today. I have put this together, and it's loosely going to be a part of this wider series that I've done on this channel. It's been a little bit since I've dedicated a particular talk to the Middle Ages series that I've been doing, but the idea is that we're revisiting some of the misconceptions about the period, about the people, their beliefs, their customs, and attempting to filter them through a different lens. Now, this isn't the only thing I seek to do on this channel. It's not complete historical revisionism. I have other things that I would like to do, but I feel like those other things are kind of downstream of first having a correct understanding of what's happening in the Middle Ages. So then some of those other conversations, you have the full context of them. But the idea here in the sort of initial introduction to the Middle Ages series of videos that I've done is to give you something other than the post-Enlightenment, post-Victorian historical narrative that many of us were weaned on. And there's a lot I would actually like to cover on this particular topic, but I'm going to limit myself to the history of disputation because I believe that it is in fact a very pertinent conversation to what's happening, especially online, especially in social media with the rise of this debate me bro culture, which is by any reasonable metric, I think, a bridge to nowhere. And it's one that we are, at this point, I think, so far involved in that there's just a level of absurdity that's taking place in the debate online sphere. And if you're not aware of this, more power to you. I envy you. But it's something that I think that it is popular enough, it's frequent enough that it needs to be addressed. And I'm going to attempt, stepping into modernity and covering some of my problems with today's sort of structure and culture of disputation. But for now, I want to get a firm grasp. I want for you guys to get a firm grasp for where all of this is actually coming from. So before we even get to the Middle Ages, you should be familiar with who the people of the Middle Ages were trying to emulate themselves, which of course was the Greeks. And that is a whole series of lectures and studies of their own. But in short, the paragon of all disputation were the Greeks. They were the model, they were the exemplars, the ones that we all try to emulate. And in particular, the paragon of this was Socrates and his method of the dialectic, which all learned men have been attempting to sort of reconstruct and emulate ever since Socrates. Now, Socrates, as filtered through Plato, says that it is by this dialectic interaction that man is capable of arriving at some grasp of reality, which is what we're ultimately trying to do in a debate. I'm going to speak more next week to the sort of errors that I see around some of the debate culture. But the idea, the noble principle of disputation, many of you are probably aware of this if you've ever done like a history of Greek philosophy or anything like that, right? Is that Plato compares human thought to an untethered horse, just sort of meandering around, not really accomplishing much of anything. And by the rigors of the dialectic method, we begin to sort of strip away those superfluous or incorrect beliefs that we may have about something like justice or goodness, whereby in the end we're able to set up a stable, indubitable, tethered definition of the thing that we seek to understand better, be that justice or goodness or truth. As well, we have Aristotle, who further systematizes the process into a more scientific rigor of logical syllogisms that are applicable to all types of this kind. And this is the inheritance of the Greeks that they bequeath to the Middle Ages and to really all of humankind. But certainly the people in the Middle Ages were consciously aware of what they were trying to emulate. Now, coming into the 11th century of Europe, we have the emergence of what I would refer to as a revitalized West. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why this happened. When you consider the papacy, for example, it had just undergone one of its truly darkest moments in all of the history of the papacy, where it's embroiled in this factional strife where the local ruling nobility of Rome, they've got their fingers in the pie, and then eventually the Holy Roman Emperor has to come in, he has to intervene, and it's a really bad look for the papacy. This is the bulk of the 10th century for the church. Now, in the process of this Rome going insular, much of the administrational side of the church, and this is across the continent, right? Much of the administrational side of the church had fallen into disrepair, which inevitably has effects on the moral standing of the clergy and members of the church. And again, this is a continental-wide problem. When Rome goes insular and doesn't actually do what Rome was intended to do, the rest of the church suffers from this. So this is an age in the vacuum of power left by Rome going inward. You have the rise of a Caesaropapism that wasn't as prevalent in the earlier centuries of the church when Rome had a little bit more of especially a moral authority. You have simony run rampant. You have adultery and sodomy, especially among the clergy. All of these things are just a major problem. And out of this, we've talked about this on this channel, come the Cluniac reforms and the Gregorian reforms. One aspect of this that we haven't really tied together is how this reforming atmosphere came to affect the intellectual life of the church. And that's kind of what we're going to hone in on a little bit today. And into this steps the first man that I want to mention, which is St. Peter Damian, doctor of the church. So Peter is, as all of these people are, a very interesting character. He is involved, he becomes over time more involved. He's originally just sort of a reform-minded man himself, and then he becomes more and more involved through the influence of Bishop Bruno, through the influence of Hildebrand, through the influence of some of these other reform-minded men, to join the sort of Cluny reforms that are taking place. So he's a pivotal player, even though he may loosely be tied to the Cluniac reforms at certain points. He's certainly among them, and certainly a pivotal player among them. And it's from him that we read of a series of disputations against the Jews that he was involved in. The curious thing about this is that unlike earlier Christian polemics against the Jews, Peter's arguments rely on a certain logical methodology that you don't necessarily see in the earlier Christian engagements. Now, unfortunately, we're not privy, as far as I'm aware, of how robust or widespread these Christian versus Jewish debates would have been. But they were enough of a feature that we have several drawn out references to these disputations in Peter's letters, and we get an idea of how he's thinking about these disputations and how he's going about them in a more methodical, logical manner than you would have seen previously. Now, St. Peter Damian at Pomposa has access to a library that contains the works of Jerome, Augustine, Ambrose, Gregory of Nazianzen, St. John Chrysostom. He's got Bede there, Isidore. He's got a large collection of works that he can draw from. So when you read him, he's drawing from all of these sources. But again, the methodology takes this crucial step towards what I would call a new dialectic. And it takes the shape in his letters of a fictitious disputation between two people arguing over the at the time, very real situation of rival claimants to the papacy. You can find this in his work, Disputatio Synodalis. So we see he's having disputes with the Jews, and we can have access to these through his letters. We see in this Synodalis that he is writing these various tracts of fictitious disputations about there was a schism at the time between Pope Gregory VII, Hildebrand when he rises to the papacy, and a rival claimant to the papacy that Peter Damian was involved in. And I think that this is actually a sort of underappreciated yet pivotal moment that we sort of step into this new phase. And this is what I'm trying to say, right? The Cluniac reforms, we often see them involved around the investiture controversy, the controversies around simony and clerical celibacy. But there was also an intellectual revitalization that takes place at the same time. Now, the next big names in this are the men that we mentioned last lecture. See, there's a method to all of this. You guys wonder sometimes where this madness tends to, and sometimes it's very intentional, the chaotic mess that I sort of draw together. Sometimes it's just very providential or fortuitous, as the case may be. But last week we were talking about Saints Lanfranc and Anselm, and these are two pivotal players at this very moment. I had mentioned last week that Lanfranc helped to place the Abbey Bec on the map. But one of the reasons that he had gained in popularity the way that he did was because he was willing to engage with a Berengar of Tours in what is really, for all intents and purposes, a very public disputation. Berengar starts teaching that there was only a spiritual. Now, with Berengar, it gets a little confusing because he is attributing it to John Duns Erigena, and it's actually a misattribution. There was another writer that Berengar mistakes as Erigena. So either way, Berengar thinks he is being faithful to Erigena, but in this writings that these teachings that he is giving, he is saying that in the Eucharist, there is only a spiritual sense in which Jesus Christ is present, not a material one. Now, again, we're at this crucial moment. If you could imagine, Berengar is like this brazen, he's like a know-it-all. If he were on YouTube, he would be dropping anathemas on everybody, challenging everybody, debate me, bruh, come at me, that kind of thing. So he's very confident in his error. One could maybe say the what is it, the Kruger effect, right? He is the one actually that initiates all of this by publicly rebuking Lanfranc. Lanfranc was kind of just doing his own thing. He's teaching at Beck. He's popular. He's in his own world. And you get a little bit of the like Berengar's punching up a little bit. He's trying to steal some of that clout by going after one of the top dogs. So Berengar writes a series of letters rebuking Lanfranc, specifically about what he calls Lanfranc's errors on John Erigena. Lanfranc actually has the real parts of Erigena that he is drawing from. Now, keep in mind where we're at in history. As all of this is sort of boiling under the surface, the first of the Cluniac reforming popes, arguably the first of the Gregorian popes, since Hildebrand was in this close circle, Pope Leo IX was just ascending to the papacy. He's crossing the Alps. He comes to Rome. It's a key moment in the history of the church when Leo IX comes to Rome. He ends the century-long debasement of the office, chair of Peter, and Rome is going to be like poised to reassert herself. A lot of people interpret this as some novelty when really it's actually just a renaissance. It's a return to the way things had been before the corruption. But anyways, so there's a reason why men like Berengar were sort of so cocksure of themselves, because up to this point, everybody there had been kind of like at least a century, a generation or more of sort of carte blanche access to say what you want, do what you want, and you wouldn't get a lot of pushback. Now, Lanfranc offers to dispute Berengar in a private setting, but Berengar demands a public audience. You kind of get an idea of the type that we're dealing with here, right? You can maybe, I don't know, think of a few people in your mind on YouTube and the debate me bro culture that might fit this stereotype. So we're at a period of, we're still, now that's the other thing too, with Pope Leo IX, we're still in a period of a very debased church. It has to pull itself out of this rut that it's in. And it does so in a very miraculous and definitive way. Now, this is the trads who kind of whine about modernity, about how the church never responds to the errors of such and such. Well, welcome to the Catholic Church, trads, because, like the Protestant exit is over there. But the reality is that these things happen at times in our history. I won't say they happen all the time, but they do happen at times. But when Rome responds, it's usually pretty definitive. And Pope Leo IX, he's a saint in the church. He had been Bishop of Toul. He had been a close ally of work at Beck, and he allows this disputation between Lanfranc and Berengar to take place. So let's give Berengar his sort of moment here, his moment in the spotlight. Berengar would, as he would come to find out, the old sort of lax way of Rome was going to be a thing of the past. There was this sort of new zeal and rigor that would completely sweep his errors into the dustbin of history. Pope Leo IX, he's like, here, man, here's your shot. Take your shot. This is your chance. Give Berengar, we're going to give him his moment in the sun to say what he needs to say. But the reality is that we're going to act pretty decisively on this. And it is a pretty decisive moment. I mean, this is where, with Lanfranc's method of disputation, it is going to kind of become the standard of the West. The evidence of its success lies in the fact that it's at this moment that the church picks up the substantial, literally substantial language that Lanfranc would use around the Eucharist, giving us the language that we would come to use as transubstantiation. That's where this word actually emerges from. And again, Berengar's errors are sort of swept to the dustbin of history until they're revitalized by the Zwinglians in the 16th century, but that's another story. Next, you get who I believe is the first real, I want to say, paradigmatic shift, and that is the main focus of our topic last time, St. Anselm. Now, we discussed him quite a bit last week, but I want to emphasize here that up to this point, with Peter Damian, with Lanfranc, you have these men who are engaged in something, but it's just kind of happening. They're not really like stepping back from it, giving sort of a meta-analysis. Whereas with Anselm, it really becomes explicit that his intention is to engage in this specific type of disputation that has now been going on several times over. He says in the opening of his Monologion, he says, quote, "Some of my brothers have persisted in asking me to give them an example of meditation by writing down some thoughts on the divine essence and other related matters, which I have communicated to them in my regular discussions, colloquia. They ask that nothing should be put forward on the authority of Scripture, and in this I have consulted their wishes rather than my own capacity or the nature of the subject. They also ask that whatever conclusion was reached in the course of each investigation should be expressed in plain language with intelligible arguments in simple disputation, simplicique disputatione, so that the necessary conclusions and clear truths of the matter would be clearly expressed." And this is, it should be pretty obvious with what he's saying there, that this is an intentional thing on Anselm's part. So even more so than Lanfranc, Anselm had the love and admiration of his students. He became famous throughout Europe, and really everyone wanted to train under him. Partly his success is due to this reworking of the old dialogical method to sort of take on a series of disputed questions. For example, why did God become man? Cur Deus homo, right? Why the God man? Which was written in the form of a dialogue with a student, Anselm and a student named Basso. And this is the context of where all of this is coming from. The 12th century Renaissance, as it's known, is a sort of coalescing of various elements all at the right moment. And like I said earlier, we don't quite know. Sometimes in history, like even like the later Renaissance, the Renaissance that everybody's sort of familiar with, it's hard to pinpoint why did the Renaissance happen. And it seems to be this just convergence of things that happens at just the right atmosphere, the right time. And at this moment, among all of the various things that sort of coalesce, not least of which would be the intellectual advancements of these men who were not pioneers so much as they were looking back into the past and drawing out of it a legacy that was and always really kind of has been ours, and then bringing it up to what was then a modern context. You can hear like he's saying in this opening monologue, his students are asking him, hey, can you do this thing in a sort of, in the way that I'm sure he had been teaching them up to this point, not even necessarily just turning to Scripture. We make these arguments in a sort of logical fashion. Now, the abbeys are the initial hub of this academic flowering. But quickly at Lyon, at Notre Dame, at Reims, at Chartres, these schools which were physically and spiritually connected to the cathedral, they start to emerge. Besides these cathedral schools that start to emerge, we have the less common, though no less influential, these other little places start to pop up that weren't born of the monastery or cathedral, but were established in smaller towns where people just kind of coalesced, like Oxford, for example, or Cologne. We don't quite know why. It seems that, from what we can gather, students were leaving the School of Paris, which was clearly connected to the cathedral there in Paris, and they would go back to England, for example, and for some reason they just started coalescing around Oxford, and eventually you get the formation of Oxford. And it's from these, that these great medieval universities come from, and eventually these sort of smaller studiums that would pop up all over Europe. Also emerging from this common pool was a genre of dialogue literature. And many of the important names of this era engaged in it. I mean, everyone from Anselm to Abelard was involved. Again, hearkening back to the Socratic dialectic of disputing ideas to get at a reasonable conclusion of an argument, especially given the influx of troublesome discoveries made by Peter Abelard, who was in his monumental work Sic et Non, Yes and No, clearly showing that there was a list of discrepancies among the early church fathers and seeming discrepancies among the texts within sacred scripture. He's sort of showing all of this stuff side by side. This church father disagrees with this church father. This passage in scripture seems to disagree with this passage in scripture. And this is sic et non, yes and no, right? And this is sort of a gauntlet that gets dropped on the students at this moment. It just took a intellectual giant like Abelard was. Abelard was his own worst enemy, but certainly given him his due, he was an intellectual giant of his time. And it was just, again, it was the right atmosphere for somebody like him to step into and make this challenge. And the students were ready to take it up. And here I would just like to make quick note that as all of this is happening, not everybody is completely happy and on board with these changes that are starting to become more and more explicit. There was a Benedictine monk, Peter of Celle, who wrote to John of Salisbury warning him of Paris, famous at this point, more and more so for its academic learning, where he says that the masters, as he wants to say in a sort of scathing way, were seldom attached to any organized community and taught free from restriction, where disputation had replaced the traditional methods of instruction, and where the curriculum could be as fleeting as the desires of the students. So you can hear the conservative voices stepping into this new sort of what they consider radical environment. And I think it's fair to say, with a unbiased lens, I'm somebody that loves the emergence of the university and the academic world that it produced. I think his cautions here are valid. And even so much as they're like criticisms that maybe certain things should be considered and maybe stopped, where he says, for example, that the masters aren't attached to a community. We haven't quite come to the age where the Franciscans and the Dominicans would step into these roles. So he's basically saying, look, you've got these people, Abelard, everybody's kind of got Abelard in the mind at this point. He's not really tied to anywhere. He's going to end up eventually being loosely tied with the Benedictines, but he's his own person. He's sort of a freewheeling bohemian, a rabble-rousing Parisian. He's teaching all of these young minds. All of them are engaged in this art of arguing and disputation. I think with the world of the modern social media and disputation, we can see where that can kind of run awry, and where the curriculum isn't this sort of perennial, primordial thing that they're engaged in from centuries forgotten up until now. So another important name of those who are critical of this is none other than Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, doctor of the church. himself a Cistercian monk famous for his preaching, was generally against this new kind of learning precisely because he saw the danger lurking in it. Were it ever to be untethered from the magisterium or from dogmatic theology in general, his concern was that men like Abelard were doing the classic, hey man, I'm just asking questions. Times these questions are intentionally leading people to a foregone conclusion. And Bernard sees these questions, the foregone conclusion, as a attempt to undermine the credibility of the church, of her traditions, of sacred scripture, and ultimately of Jesus Christ himself. And again, I think in this context, Bernard has a valid point. Anselm was a problem. And I cover this at length I cover Bernard's disputes with Anselm. It's older. I think I've switched over to a podcast. You could find it. It's called I did kind of a clickbaity thumbnail for it, but it was like a boxing match. It was Bernard actually does enter the fray and dispute with Abelard, though Bernard really just wanted Abelard to be condemned and be done with it. You have to go back to watch that if you're interested in that full story. But you will hear from some other corners a dislike of this development as well. I have heard other corners, in like modernity, I have heard from Eastern Orthodox say that right here at this moment, with Anselm in particular, this is when Rome really begins to slip away. Oh, and look, it just so happens to coincide with, 1054 and Pope Leo IX, and then Hildebrand and the Gregorian reforms. Clearly, right, like this is all signs that Rome has untethered herself from the ancient bark of Peter. The problem with that, there's multiple problems with that. A major problem with that is that the Orthodox, this would be a topic for another day, but it suffices to say that the same problems that exist for us, that the students of this time and the masters of this time are attempting to address, the Orthodox have many of those same. The church fathers are church fathers that we share together. So it's not like they can just kind of like ignore it, hand wave it away, and the problem goes away. They can do that. That's what they've done by and large. But, you have the disputation, as noted, has this long-standing tradition in the West. You have these two men engaging in a dialogue, arguing out the details of a debated point, and the same contradictions that exist in the early church fathers exist for us, that we are engaged in a disputation over right now, also exist for the Eastern Orthodox, but they have sort of a different approach of handling that, if you want to call it handling it. One of the ways that they'll say is, for example, like Photius saying to cover the nakedness of the fathers, because Photius realized that some of the Western fathers, in fact, quite a few of the Western fathers taught the filioque. He said, let's just cover that nakedness and not really contend with it. Okay, that's fine. But the solution to the problem is a development, if that's how you want to consider it, that the Orthodox, their development is, we're just going to ignore it. The Western solution was a little bit more robust, which was to sort of hammer out these differences. Now, just as allegorically one can pull from the story of Noah, we find places in sacred scripture where disputation takes place. So we're not like completely out of our element here. So even in declaring that, that's how you would handle the sic et non of Abelard, who's to say that theirs is more correct? Because this is one of the things that's it's not something that the early church fathers take up themselves in earnest. Now, yes, the Eastern Orthodox can say, oh, well, Photius was an early church father, so much as he was for them. And they could say that, look, we're turning to him. This is what he recommends to do. But we also have, there is disputation that takes place in the history of the church. I mean, this is what the ecumenical councils are largely a part of. But there's disputations that are taking place regardless of that. It's just that the method is a little bit more systematic, a little bit more logical at this period in time than it would have been in the past. It just so happened that at this period, Byzantium was entering this time of a long decline that would eventually lead to their destruction of the entire empire. The West was at the same time, as we're discussing here, emerging as a powerful player. The fruits of our development, I think, kind of speak for themselves. You know, who's the world religion today? But again, that's a topic for another day. Going back to Abelard, one of the shifts that happens is when folk who are trying to dispute and refute Abelard in turn begin incorporating his method of this yes, no, pro, con, sed contra, responsio dialectic to their own refutations. So it's kind of an astonishing development, but it's absolutely crucial. William of St. Thierry, a friend of Bernard's, treats Abelard to his own medicine when he engages Abelard in the same kind of rhetorical dialogue that Abelard is engaged in. It's like you could imagine everybody's sort of doing the old way. Abelard sort of comes in, he's got this style of doing things, and nobody quite knows how to respond to it. This is William stepping in, and he's sort of tossing it back to Abelard in the same methodological way that Abelard does. Abelard doesn't quite know, like it sort of stumbles him, right? Thomas of Morgny does the same thing. Now, probably the most consequential of all of these people is a former student of Abelard named Peter Lombard, who, with his compilation of sources known as the Sentences, provides the Summa Centarium, provides the medieval intellectual world, the corpus for almost all future disputation until the Renaissance and the rise of the humanists. And it's almost impossible to overstate, but it's not wholly due to the Sentences, as you could gather that this had been brewing in the air for over a century at this point, as we've been discussing. But by the 12th century, the world of academic disputation began to take on a life of its own. Listen to this kind of astonishing quote from Peter the Chanter of Notre Dame that he writes in 1192 about the role of the theologian. Quote, "The training of Holy Scripture consists of three exercises: reading, lectio, disputating, disputatio, and preaching, predicatio, against which the prolixity is the enemy, the mother of oblivion, and the stepmother of memory. First, reading is laid down like the basement and foundation for what follows, so that from this source all support is derived by the other two exercises. Secondly, the structure or walls of disputation are put in place for, as Gregory says, nothing is fully understood or faithfully preached unless first chewed or ground by the tooth of disputation. Thirdly, the proof of preaching is erected so that he who hears says, I came, and thus the crowd draws the crowd. One should preach after, not before, the reading of Holy Scripture and the investigation of doubtful matters. The Christian religion truly consists of faith and good conduct, of which reading and disputation pertain to faith and preaching to conduct." End quote. So right there, right in the middle of reading and preaching, he has placed disputation. This is something that the theologian is now required to do. Now, of course, the juggernaut, we've had quite a few juggernauts at this point, but I think the juggernaut introduced into all of this is the so-called new logic of Aristotle, which comes into the university in the 12th century, and it goes through its whole incorporation into the curriculum. along with the Lombard, the introduction of Aristotle to the culture of debate really can't be overstated. Where the Lombard is responding specifically to the challenges of Abelard, and he sort of gives us the style of the high medieval disputation and what it was going to take. Aristotle kind of systematizes it and makes it a science. And as well, Aristotle throws in some challenges of his own. Like there was some certain challenges that Aristotle had to the eternality of the universe and whatnot. In his work, The Topics, Aristotle provides an art to argumentation where the debater goes on a sort of quest for all of the arguments available to a given topic. And you'll see this come to its own when you see in the Middle Ages anyways, when you see the writings of like St. Thomas in his Summa, which so like meticulously goes through a whole series of objections and then replies to those objections. Then you have men like Adam of Balsam and John of Salisbury who undertake the task of finding all of the ways that arguments could be fallacious. Of course, here again, drawing from Aristotle's Organon, but also making their own additions and contributions to the style. And all of this is to equip the theologian, as Peter the Chanter was saying earlier, as part of the job of the theologian, right? It's not just to read, to study. It's not just to preach the word, but it's also this sort of median point of disputation where we sort of come to truths. And this arsenal that they're coming with now, that they're to make it through university, you've got to make it through Aristotle. Then you have to do commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, which it's your own importance. And the purpose of the commentaries is not just that you're commentating on the sources of scripture that Peter Lombard uses and the florilegia of early church father sources that he provides, but it's also to answer Abelard's challenge. They're not always, like, at a certain point, they're no longer specifically addressing Abelard's challenge, but they are, at least in their remote intention, still responding to the problems that Abelard has brought in, which is like, hey, man, some of this stuff doesn't seem to add up. So how do we make sense of it? So they're given this arsenal of logical and rhetorical weapons to use in the pursuit of truth. That's what the commentary on the sentences is about. You are displaying to the university, to the master, as a student, that you are now capable of engaging in this level of disputation and of excising certain errors or misunderstandings or discrepancies. John of Salisbury says, quote, "In military matters, a commanding officer must first see that his army is properly supplied with arms and other military equipment. In like manner, the contriver of the science of reasoning, that is, Aristotle, the drill master, those who profess to be logicians, has in the foregoing books, as it were, provided the means of disputation, and stacked in the arena arms for the use of his students. This he has done by explaining the meaning of uncombined words and clarifying the nature of propositions and topics." This is all Aristotelian logic, right? His next step is to show his disciples how they may use these instruments and how to teach them the art of engaging in argumentative combat. As if the set of members of the contestants in motion, he shows them how to propose and how to answer questions, as well as how to prove and evade. I like how we tossed in evade there. But yeah, no, I mean, like, what are we doing with Aristotle when we learn to recognize fallacious arguments, when we learn to set up syllogistic arguments? We're learning how to propose and to answer the questions of certain arguments and how to prove our argument, right? Because our arguments have to be based on certain axioms and first principles. So if you look at this as the sort of bedrock, the soil upon which later thinkers would emerge in the West emerges as the result of all of this as the intellectual giants. And it's because they stood on the shoulders, the later thinkers, I'm talking like later Renaissance, Baroque, no matter how you want to think of these, even with the emergence of later post-Cartesian philosophy and post-Bacon science and empiricism, like you have to pay your due to the rigors that these people established at this point. The reason why the Parisian theologians of this time were like a Mongolian army at the heights of Genghis Khan, trampling over heresy left and right, leaving the pile of skulls in their wake, is because this period of disputation turned them into the equivalent of like intellectual special ops. Added to this, you have the very important development of the mendicant revolution. So imagine this. Early Christianity was, in many sense, quite radical. Many of the great thinkers and preachers weren't necessarily of the elite. It was the in many cases, I know there was a top-down approach often to evangelization, but in many cases, Christianity, I mean, it's kind of the underdog religion. Christ is the ultimate underdog. You wonder where there's always been this sense of like noble birth and, rendering to Caesar and all of the noblesse oblige and aristocracy and all of these things. But in the West, anyways, there's developed this culture of the underdog, and it has its roots, it has its antecedents in the entire Christian story. So, it is an underdog religion. Now, monastics, whether of wealthy or poor origins, were known for their renunciation of the world. But then as things begin to settle, walk down through the centuries of ancient Europe, medieval Europe, early medieval period, things begin to change a bit. Famous monastery becomes pretty much like prime real estate. And say the 9th, 10th centuries, wealthy families would take one of their sons and put the son in the monastery for reasons that were largely worldly as opposed to spiritual. Now, there's exceptions to this always, but by and large, the monasteries become something much different at the turn of the millennium than what they had started as. And so that's where, with the Dominicans and the Franciscans, with Dominic and Francis, they sort of provide the church with these return back to what was supposed to be the more primitive intent of the life of a monastic. And the way that they did that was by emphasizing these charisms of particular poverty. The mendicant, that's what it is, right? It's an order of beggars. And for the first time, really anyone of any social status, because of this, by the sheer intellect alone, could sort of work their way up to very high positions of power in society. And without overstating it, I believe that the mendicant orders are the first instance of something like a meritocracy. And because of that, we see yet another piece of this puzzle, this sort of coalescing, come together. No longer was it just about who your mama and your daddy was. Now you could stand on the merits of your learning and ability to preach alone. So a precocious young man from humble origins could now join one of these mendicant orders, get trained, and possibly in a short time end up with a prestigious chair in a major university. And it's sort of like the perfect storm. You have the right environment for the right person to step into. And this is why we have at this time these sort of succession of these great minds. Albert the Great, Bonaventure, Thomas, John Duns Scotus, all of these like apex of minds, these towering minds, all in one quick successive span. And this, of course, carries itself well into modernity. Even as late as Florence in the Middle Ages, the Greek delegates that arrived seemed to think, I don't know quite what Byzantium, I'm a little bit less knowledgeable about of this period, but it seems that when the Greeks arrived, to Florence to sort of have their debates, that they kind of had in their minds that they're dealing with the old school West. But Florence, at some of these like disputations that are taking place, is, at this point by the 15th century, Florence takes I think, kind of takes the medieval cake for being one of the most robust. It's honestly, it's one of the most robust intellectual ecumenical councils in all of history. All you have to do is just go through and read some of the acta of Florence and get an idea of how strongly they debated a lot of the topics that they debated. And the Greeks were kind of taken aback by it. The best that the Greeks had, you take somebody like Bessarion, in ways, kind of came to realize like they couldn't compare with the rigors of the disputations as they had sort of come to this sharpened point. He comes over and is won to the Latin side at Florence. And even Mark of Ephesus, probably the best that they had as far as opposition that never came around to the reunion. At most, the Eastern Orthodox could say was that he gave the Latins a run for their money. He certainly didn't win the Latins over to his side. And, they would probably argue, I want to spend a little bit more time with Florence, so I don't want to completely give my opinion away here, but I have some suspicions that Mark of Ephesus doesn't come out as strong and rigorous at Florence as some of the Eastern Orthodox would like him to be. But many of them won home, that the Greeks that is, and had to sort of make up these stories about why they were, how they were starved and mistreated, and that's why their performance was so bad at Florence. But the reality was that you've had Florence by the 15th century, you've had, several centuries of this disputation culture and these, to be a cardinal at this point that's going to be invited, a bishop that's going to be invited to Florence, and then you're actually going to be arguing there. You had some pretty great minds. And one of the major developments that happens in the 13th century is that more and more of the universities begin to gain their independence, especially those that sort of arose out of the cathedral schools, Paris, Chartres. Well, Paris would be the Notre Dame, some of these other cathedral schools. And this level of autonomy added to both their strength and their weaknesses, as is often the case, because they had increasing levels of independence. The church saw the university as a safe haven to have disputations, to come in and to dispute the kind of ideas that you and I shouldn't necessarily be having amongst ourselves. Certainly the untrained shouldn't be having, since they'll cause scandal. And this is where the idea of one of the sort of defining hallmarks of the West, when people want to speak of the West, is this sort of ontological thing. You have to consider that the development of the academic privilege or academic freedom, there was a license for experts in their fields of study to hold disputes, even public disputes over controversial ideas. And this, honestly, until modernity, was a feature of Western academia. Even Oxford, even during the worst periods of the Reformation, still held on to the embers of academic freedom and tenure and these ideas, such that when things begin to kind of cool off in Britain in the 19th century, we see a flowering of Anglo-Catholicism. This is not by accident. And of course, since the time of the French Revolution and the rise of Marxist ideology, the left has largely tried to excise this from our history. And they've been successful at it. You have to admit, in many ways, today the universities are places of further social propagation of leftist ideologies. They were once places that even a Marxist could go to dispute his ideas. And in the most rigorous of the university cultures, you could come with your ideological preferences and seek to win over the audience. And this is why you see Thomas and other scholastics, they were more than willing to engage with folk they disagreed with. In fact, they encouraged it in many ways. Now, you take someone like Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, in particular, absolutely hated this aspect of what they referred to as the liberal intelligentsia. Those who were willing, those liberals who were willing to play ball with us, to come over and argue their ideas. Lenin hated it. And, everyone gets mad at Hitler and the Nazis for being anti intellectual, which they were in a very un European way. But when they were engaged in this, they were really simply borrowing from the Leninist playbook. Lenin said, "You're a damned fool if you, Mr. Liberal Professor, with your books go and lecture and hand over, think that by your lectures and you're debating with the capitalists that they're just going to hand over the means of production to the proletariat." Absolutely not. He said the communists must be willing to lie, to deceive, to manipulate, to use every means at your disposal to bring about the world revolution. Mao just took it even further and said that the political ends are gained at the end of a barrel of a gun. Now, Mr. Liberal Marxist professor, in the end, I would argue, did much better than Lenin, in fact, did. They actually, Mr. Liberal professor with his tweed, and not in the 20th century with his little tweed coats and his pipe that was in there arguing Marxist intellectualism, a sort of soft socialism, they give them their due. They won the minds of many students. Those students who then in the 1960s grew up, took over the universities themselves, and they turned them into the indoctrination beds that Lenin had only dreamed of. Now, of course, there's an argument that both Lenin and to a degree the Nazis offer, which I think is a valid argument, is that in an environment where you're dealing with, let's say, large groups of people who share almost no foundational principles in common, how far can disputation of this old medieval type really take you? These guys, in a sense, in the Middle Ages, took for granted that their interlocutors shared many of the worldviews that they did. Even in disputes with the Jews, there was enough commonality that the people that were debating these things, they weren't dumb, right? Like they could, if there would have been something that they would have been introduced to, they would have figured this out on their own. But even with the Jews, they said, look, there's enough commonality here that this process isn't totally fruitless. And we know that certain Jews were won over through these disputations. But certainly, I think we can acknowledge that two people who believe that the Ten Commandments are the basis for human morality will have a much more productive dispute or debate, however you want to say it, about, legislating good laws for society than someone who believes that the Ten Commandments are divinely inspired, arguing with someone who believes that they're a moral evil or that they're amoral or whatever the case may be. Lenin, he at least claimed he wanted to open up the Comintern to free debates among fellow communists, fellow Bolsheviks. Now, of course, later Stalin purges all of those ones who dared to speak up, but Lenin at least says, hey, within the Bolshevik paradigm, you can disagree with this or with that or with the other. St. Dominic wanted to make the order of preachers an effective tool against the Cathars. But they had way more success within the university climate than they did within the land of the Albi. Because you're just dealing with two totally radically different groups of people. The Albigensians, unfortunately, eventually had to be, the church finally just dealt with them in a much more strong-arm way. The Albigensians weren't converted by the effective preaching and disputing of the Dominicans, as much as the Dominicans may not admit that. So when we're giving an analysis of where we are today and how we could reclaim some of this, what I would call greatness, I do believe we need to properly assess in what environment did the world of the disputation culture grow out of, And is it possible to rein in what's taking place now and reproduce that old style among ourselves? And when you hear me say I want to see Catholics debating Catholics, Catholics disputing with Catholics, it's in this context that I speak about these things. It's in this context that I'm looking about it. This isn't to say that we shouldn't be having debates with non Catholics, but when we're sort of all over the place, I see people making horrible arguments in the name of the Catholic Church online. People who have no sense of formal unity, no sense of which issues that we should be even like debating with non-Catholics and which ones we shouldn't. I don't really see anything but bad fruit coming out of the way that things are happening right now. And this is what we're going to be talking about next week. But to wrap up this discussion, when the university comes into its own, it produces this flowering of learning that has made possible by the rigors of the world of disputation its students had been immersed in. I remember, by way of analogy, in the first UFC fights, Ultimate Fighting Championships, I used to have them on DVD. This little tiny guy, Royce Gracie, this little tiny Brazilian guy, was beating these giants of men in the octagon. And eventually, you see the sportscasters, at first, they have no idea what's happening. They're like, how is this little tiny Brazilian guy walking through all of these? I mean, it was the early days of the UFC. Anybody could walk in, the biggest guys, the strongest guys, the toughest guys. And here, this was before anybody knew what Brazilian Jiu Jitsu really was. So Royce comes in, and the sportscasters are trying to catch up a little bit. And by the end of it, they asked Royce, I remember they said, "Hey, how did you manage to do that?" And Royce said that he had spent so many months training with his brother, Rickson, that by the time he was done, he was ready to take on anyone else. He was like, "Dear Lord, give me anyone else but Rickson." If you know, you know, right? Rickson Gracie was like the tough, he was and probably would rank among like the toughest Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners in the world in his heyday. And I've actually met people who trained with him, and they compared it to like Dante's Purgatory, right? Like a torture session. But hey, after you train with somebody like that, the average Joe on the street is nothing. It's a walk in the park on a breezy day. So when you hear me complain about these debate me bros and this culture of anxiety that arises around debates, and we've got to engage in debates, and you even got people that have made almost a career out of it. There's certain reasons why I think that the Catholic audiences, and even in some senses more so those interlocutors, those that would be involved in the debates, need to avoid them. It's that A, because Catholics need to, I think, return to a more rigorous method of argumentation before they enter that arena, and B, coming out of that process, they need to know, I think, which topics are the ones that Catholics should be disputing publicly with non-Catholics and which we shouldn't. And that's an important distinction that I never really see being made. Now, I didn't even get to the role of what contemplation is in this. That's a major part of what I am involved in my own personal studies. From these series of lectures that you can apply into the world in your own way, maybe even sometimes if you just recognize some of what's happening. I see some of my ideas sort of filtering out there slowly, smally, is that a word? Slowly, little by little, I guess. And it's now, as a man, as a human being, it would be nice to get some credit when you see something that that you're the one who actually was the first one to like. I've gone back sometimes. It's like, yeah, nobody was bringing this up before I did, but it's whatever. The important thing is that the ideas get out. It's the message, not the man. And everybody, I think, seems to have lost context. I say everybody, almost nearly everybody seems to have lost context. And in my opinion, for Catholics, this is unacceptable. We do history of disputation. So we can't completely write it off, nor should we completely write it off. But we need to have certain guardrails. We're not just a free for all, do whatever you want to do. People dropping their opinions on social media, acting like they're speaking for the church, having no reference to anything other than their own solipsism. They then refuse, a lot of the times when other Catholics, I see a lot of you guys that I get an idea of the fallacies to the arguments that others are making. Haley, I think if you're watching, that's my favorite thing to see. But we got to do better, guys. That's sort of my takeaway. You sit down, you look around, you see what's happening. And the saddest thing about all of this is that the Catholic Church, I say this all the time, it's sort of my theme. We sit on a gold mine. We sit on a treasure trove. We sit in the middle of an oasis, and we're up on top of the palm tree looking around at the desert, complaining that there's no water, there's no dates. It's all right here. It's right with us. It's in the church. It's in the place that we're in. The church has provided us with all the tools, with all the weapons, with all the resources that we need to take on the world. You just have to be willing to do some work, to apply yourself, and to. That's what I've got. No comments in the chat. Hopefully, I didn't put all 5 of you to sleep. But, anyways, I will see you next time. God bless.